What do postmodern neo-Marxists even want? AKA intersectional feminists. Hey, it's Prince of Queens, and this is a bit of a follow-up video to the video that I published on the second Intersectional Feminism is Communist Particle Board, which explains the exact trajectory of how the United States Communist Party evolved into intersectional feminism in the current year, stopping briefly through postmodernism, which ended up manifesting itself as intersectional feminism to a vague but very clear degree. It's an hour long, but it's by far my most informative video to date, and it's actually over 90% information and not just my opinions. I'm just stating the facts that I found in my research in that video and showing a few clips of people explaining their perceptions and stories. However, I had a fairly long private conversation with a viewer who has long considered themselves a leftist and I believe even a feminist, but does not at all consider themselves a communist or Marxist. This person found the video very fascinating and informative and absolutely did not attempt to argue with the information within it. They did legitimately feel as if I had explained something about the communist nature of the contemporary left, aka the intersectional feminist cultural movement, that they had not understood, but now they fully admit that it's a very clear reality. However, it left them with the question that they wanted answered, which was, what do these people envision for the future? You acted like they didn't even have any idea what they wanted the world to look like. Surely they have something in mind for the future, right? You see, in my video, I casually mentioned that after the Cold War, when people learned about the atrocities of the Soviet Union and Red China, the people who were once affiliated with the Communist Party of the United States largely gave up on the dream of a communist utopia. But they also didn't give up on their core beliefs as communists in terms of seeing the world through the lens of the oppressed and the capitalist oppressors. The person I chatted with basically told me repeatedly, it can't be so simple as wanting a communist nation that is headed by a woman of color instead of Stalin, right? I just feel like there has to be more to it. But the sad fact of the matter is that I honestly don't really think that there is. And here's why.
And when I hear someone say, that wasn't real communism, I know what they mean. What they mean was, if I was the dictator in Stalin's shoes, I personally would have brought in the utopia. That's what that statement means. Or it means an ignorance of history that's so utterly appalling that any political statement made on behalf of that person whatsoever should immediately be followed by a paroxysm of extreme embarrassment.
Here's the thing. Almost every person who openly self-identifies as any sort of communist is under the age of 40. Most are under 30, very often under 25, and I think this cultural trend of young self-identified communists, often brandishing the red and black logos on their social media profiles, must obviously be a sign of the education system doing a dismally poor job of explaining the collapse of the Soviet Union, or basically anything about Maoist China. I personally had this exact experience with my education, actually. And of course, I went to school in one of the most far leftist public school districts in North America, the Seattle Public School District, where my middle and high school were within walking distance of the hip gay neighborhood and everything. Like Jordan Peterson claims at another point in the video clip that I just showed, yes, I did hear all about all sorts of horrible things related to Hitler. Though, to be truthful, that stuff was also in media when I was growing up, as there were so many stories that ended up having some sort of cameos or another by people who followed some version of Hitler's ideology. And I think that the honest truth of why that was has simply to do with the fact that we did engage in a war against Nazi Germany directly during World War II. However, the war we fought with the Soviet Union never included battlefields or bombs being dropped. The Cold War was just a lot of intimidation, espionage, spying, racing to get to space first, the Soviets trying to get the nuclear weapons, and selling people on the idea that capitalism was good if you were in the West, or that communism was good if you were in Eastern Europe. Thus, it's probably always been rather hard to simply explain to people what exactly the communists did, why exactly Stalin killed so many people, why other people in his society ended up starving or freezing to death, and why this idea of communism will always be something that looks good on paper but leads to the most disastrous consequences imaginable. You see, even if every public school teacher in the United States took it upon themselves to firmly attempt to explain to their students that communism is evil and kills people or whatever, which is the exact opposite of the case in many instances, unfortunately, I don't really think that they would have all that much luck getting through to their students if they tried, because it's hard to even conceptualize what communism is at a young age, and by the time they would be old enough to even understand it, they would also be old enough to rebel and embrace it to spite their teachers and parents. That is something that very likely has actually happened with a lot of people who end up self-identifying as Marxists, or anarcho-communists, or intersectional feminists that were inspired by Marx, but didn't agree with his outdated patriarchal sentiments, or whatever. But of course, it can't be a mere act of ignorance of the reality of communist regimes that have inspired people in prosperous liberal democracies to end up self-identifying as communists, because really, we should take a look at some of the people that have actually gotten into this type of thing.
By the way, I have no idea what your politics are now. I'm not even going to ask you. But I was interested that you described this as like a religious community almost.
There is a really strong faith-based component. You become absolutely sure that you're right and nothing's going to sway you from it. You've set your course, you've figured it out.
So it didn't seem from your description like there were a lot of other inputs coming into the cell. It seemed almost totally self-referential. You talk only to people you're in.
Please believe me when I say that in the postmodern left, people never really justify why they feel the way that they do all that much. If you grew up in the environment that I did, you were simply raised to feel that diversity was good. You were to never make fun of girls who wore hijabs or even ask too many questions about why they wore them. And you were told that females were disadvantaged, while you simultaneously witnessed them getting literally every advantage available. You were told that the rich were greedy and that community was more important than money and superficial success. And the whole time, you were told that while communism was responsible for many, many more deaths than Hitler, which they always admitted to, you also were never really told why so many people died under communism, or that you should in any way reject the idea that government should help the needy. And if you got the chance to criticize affirmative action quotas, it was always in a discussion format, saying things like, some would say that these race-based policies are discriminatory, but blah 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 blah. That being said, I think that the main thing to keep in mind is that these are vague, moralistic sentiments that somewhat resemble communism, which are inherited if you grow up or are a young adult in far leftist areas, like I was. And they are something that are being taught to people by people who generally inherited these sentiments themselves on a cultural level. You see, even if somebody wasn't a full-blown red diaper baby during the 1950s and 1960s, being raised by a covert communist or former member of the Communist Party of the United States, they still very likely mixed with all sorts of people who were raised by communists, as vaguely or overtly communist sentiments became a part of the protest culture during the Civil Rights Movement and the Vietnam War Rebellion. I've been trying to get around to making a video called The Religion of the Faithless Left, in which I will go over the staples of leftist values, such as environmentalism, multiculturalism, worship of the sacred feminine, and other such values that seem universal and assumed from most people within leftist circles. Now, is there a sly conspiracy of domestic communists within the United States who are still trying to smash the entire capitalist state, and they're receiving money from wealthy Islamic governments and wealthy Islamists, hoping to recruit as many people as they can to topple our democracy without knowing what will happen once they do? Well, I sadly do believe that such a thing actually does exist. But the thing to keep in mind about it is this. These people are true believers, for the most part. They aren't independent-minded, and they are authoritarians. Like, really, really, really authoritarian. Basically, each and every one of them believes that there is somebody else out there who knows more about politics than they do, which is why most of the followers are white people that have a lot of privilege guilt or whatever. So, when Jordan Peterson says...
And when I hear someone say, that wasn't real communism, I know what they mean. What they mean was, if I was the dictator in Stellan's shoes, I personally would have brought in the utopia. That's what that statement means.
Most of these people legitimately don't feel as if they personally are the future communist dictator that will create the one world, governmentless government or whatever. Rather, they look up to people like Nikita Oliver because she's simultaneously megalomaniacally egotistical in that she seemingly legitimately convinced herself that she will save all of the underprivileged minorities, at least in Seattle, because, well, I guess she's allegedly an underprivileged minority or something, which means she clearly has all the answers.
That employment or that income increase in the communities that need it most, which is part of what prompted why we decided, and I say we because it wasn't a decision I made on my own and it wasn't an act I did on my own, why we decided to run a candidate for mayor who represented the interests of the most marginalized, most vulnerable, to start changing that, as opposed to just talking about it or complaining about it, which liberals do a lot of talking. We're pretty hypercritical. We really wanted to be solution-oriented, believing that the most impacted people in our city really have the brilliant solutions to help change that.
Here's the thing. I believe that some of these people do think that they have solutions on a small scale. And truthfully, maybe some of them actually do have a few ideas that could help local communities. I wouldn't say that such things would be impossible, as communist-ish operations can be successful in terms of, co-op grocery stores and communal living spaces. Maybe even there's been communist mayors in the past that have done a few good things for their cities. However, when you try to get these people outside of the immediate needs and wishes of their own communities and attempt to ask these people about any sort of grand vision for the future, it is of absolutely no surprise that they simply don't have any answers, and they sound like counterpoints.
Well, revolutions have worked in Russia and China, but no elected politician has ever even come close to ending capitalism in the US, so why do you think that will work? What's to stop whoever you elect from getting absorbed by the same corrupt, finance-backed system that every politician eventually has to swear allegiance to? Well, you're not entirely wrong, but on the other hand, Chinese and Soviet communism were not exactly super great, and in any case, I'm having a little bit of trouble imagining a 1917-style revolutionary army marching down.
There's a reason why these people are vague and downright cowardly when they speak about their governmental opinions. It's because they simply don't really have any, because in the end, most of them have no idea that whoever the hell really is leading the communist organizations that they might be associated with has absolutely zero end goal besides smashing the capitalist state, or at the very least, removing as many white men from power as they possibly can, because reasons. These people were born into the religion of the faithless left, like I was, and until they question their base assumptions about life and how America is evil and white men are horrible, they will follow whichever leader is prominent at any given moment, even if it's truly a case of the blind leading the blind. And that's all there is to it. These people want to do what is right by the most vulnerable and marginalized, and the only thing that they usually have in common is that they believe that the United States and capitalism has failed the most marginalized and vulnerable. And while they might benefit from finding a new way of viewing the world entirely, that would almost certainly be too difficult for them, because that would require abandoning all of the local activist and nonprofit groups that are ran by either full-blown self-proclaimed Marxists that have a deep, deep hatred of capitalism because, I don't know, the capitalists were mean to them, or at the very least, the nonprofits are headed by intersectional feminist ideologues. So if these people were to give up on the nonprofit world, they would feel lost and alone, and so instead, they cling to the establishment of the legacy nonprofit world, hoping some good will come of it, even though they pretty much never see any results, and capitalism keeps capitalisming on. If you liked this video, please consider becoming a regular patron of mine as a subscriber on PayPal. Thanks a bunch.